Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Alexandra Alvarado, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Education here at the American Apartment Owners Association. I am so thrilled that you could join us today. We are going to talk today about something we've never had a webinar about, so that's always an exciting thing. We're going to talk about electric vehicle charging and, more importantly, how it is a potential source of revenue for you, and also just learning the basics. I think, me included, I don't know a whole lot about electric vehicle charging and how the setup works in multifamily, but I do know it is something that is becoming increasingly more needed and also in demand by renters. So we've brought on a few experts with us from actually a few different companies that are going to give us the scoop on it. So we have Adrian Gomez with EV Refleet or EVRF, and he's been in the EV space for 10 years. For those of you who are just joining EV, electric vehicle charging, I hope you got the connection there. He's educated 4,100 plus people and assessed 15,000 vehicles for electrification. He helped Lucid Motors close $1 billion Series D and is an early contributor to the new electric vehicle division at OPG. So lots of experience on the business side of electric vehicle charging. And then we have with us Paul Alden from Innovations, 36 years in public safety, advancing from firefighter to captain. Really interesting background. Also during that time was a real estate broker and owner, like many of you on the call, and is currently a senior business development manager at Innovations, deploying net zero solutions. We also have with us Dave Hine from Innovations, 40 years of engineering experience. So love having an engineer on the call who's going to share some of that. And he also has experience with LED installation across 350 DCFC and 250 L2 chargers across the US. If you're wondering what those acronyms are, you may know what they are after this webinar, so don't worry. Deployed the first EV charger in Tampa Bay in collaboration with AAA, very cool. And Chris Werner from Infinity Rack, over 20 years in the solar space, managed over 5,000 solar installations, a licensed commercial general contractor, master electrician, roofing, and solar qualifier in 18 states. So he has the electric vehicle charging experience, but also in solar as well. So very much knowledge that we need to know in those areas. We also have with us Jessica, who Adrian is going to introduce for us. She's not on the slide, but before we do that, I did want to mention one more thing. We are recording this entire presentation, and we will be sending you the slides tomorrow. So take notes, but don't worry if you miss anything. And also we will be having questions. We'll pause throughout and at the end have questions for all of our speakers here today. If we don't get to your question, they will be following up with you after the webinar. This is estimated to take about an hour, but depending on how many questions you have, we may stay a little later. So we'll see how that goes. And please put your questions in the question box and not the chat. So the question box is different. That's going to help us to organize the questions just a little bit better so that we don't miss any. So with all of that being said, thank you, all of you, for joining in today. And thank you to our speakers. Adrian, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Alexandra. We're very excited to be here with all of you. And the topic for today is electric vehicle charging for rental property owners. But before we go there, I think it's important to take a step back and really think about where we are in the world. Our perspective at EV Refleet is that we're going through a once-in-a-century event. Our transportation system is transforming. And those of us who prepare themselves for this EV transition, who learn about EVs, about charging infrastructure, are going to be able to create more value for themselves and for their organizations. So we created EV Refleet to organize a series of boot camps that help people address some of these topics that are difficult and confusing. So today's learning goals, for example, are, why should I care about electric car charging? What are the fundamentals of EV charging? So, and by the way, EV stands for electric vehicle. How do I make money by offering EV charging, and where do I get started? I've been in this space for over 10 years. I've worked for automakers and utilities. I've also started a software company and provided solutions to various EV charging station owners. And throughout all this period, I noticed that getting into this industry is tough. It's just confusing. It's overwhelming. So we created EV Refleet and the EV Charging Institute to break up all these complicated topics into manageable pieces. And so we've been doing these EV boot camps with reputable organizations. We do this for Pacific Gas and Electric, which is one of California's largest utilities. We also do this with a variety of municipalities and other clients. And so we basically take all these pieces and we break them up into 3 parts so that it's more digestible and easier for people to understand. The focus for today is going to be part 1. So our session today will help you learn the basics of electric vehicle charging, and our future sessions will help you start to choose equipment, look at incentives, and get started. You'll find that our approach is highly practical. We don't want to just give you a bunch of fluffy information. We really want to make EVs common sense. That is, in fact, our mission. Our mission at EV Refleet is to make electric vehicles common sense because that helps all of us. And stay tuned, because at the end of our presentation, I'm going to unveil a little gift that we have for all of you. So just to reiterate, we are presenting an EV bootcamp, which is something that this EV Refleet, the organization I represent, do this with a variety of organizations across the US. Our session today will be focused on understanding the basics, and we'll share more information for you about the other sessions at the end. So one last quick comment about EV Refleet before we go. That's a picture of my co-founder. He's an engineer with over a decade of experience. Both of us combined have over 20 decades of experience in engineering and the electric vehicle space. We've helped thousands of people prepare for the EV future, and we work with credible organizations regularly, like PG&E, AAA, AAOA, and others. So let's start with a quick poll question. Alexandra, do you mind jumping into the first one?
Sure,
Okay.
just pull it up. What do you consider the primary benefit of electric vehicle charging stations in multifamily rental properties? So go ahead and answer those questions if you're seeing that in front of you, and kind of let us know what you would think is the best benefit for you that you can see. And we have a few options. So generating revenue, I think that's important, right? But also the property value going up just by offering that your NOI and all that helps with that, incentives and rebates, marketing your property as green. Obviously, tenants are, especially younger ones, are becoming more conscious of that. So let's go ahead and see what y'all voted. All right. There you go. Adrian, can you see those?
I can see them. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I see the majority of you are interested in how to generate revenue from your tenants. And this is great because it's one of the topics that we'll cover today. But you'll see that there's a lot of value and opportunities for you to create value through EV charging. The other thing I wanted to mention is our goal in these sessions, and part of the reason why people really enjoy this approach, is because we really try to encourage back and forth conversations. So please feel free to ask any questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. I see in our Q&A that there is a question from somebody asking about a multifamily property. So Dave, if you or Paul don't mind just typing an answer, I think that would be helpful so that we can keep going. So what we'll do today is we're going to talk about what are some of the challenges that people have with electric vehicles and how you can sort of maximize the value for your properties. We're going to start with an overview of electric vehicles. We'll then go into charging. We're going to talk about the electricity bill because it's really important. And lastly, we'll talk about how to prepare your business case for EV charging. So Alexander, do you mind jumping into our next poll question?
Sure thing.
Thank
What
you.
type of rental property do you own or manage? So this will give us a good idea. Also, I'm assuming a lot of you probably are going to be thinking about electric vehicle charging if you're multifamily, but it's still something you could offer as a single family, duplex or triplex commercial owner. So let's see what you all put in here. I love the quick response. We're already over 50%. So let's go ahead and share what we got. All right. Those are the results here. Looks like most are multifamily, 5+ units.
Okay. Thank you for that. Great. So you'll see that it's interesting with multifamily properties when you think about EV charging, there are some specific considerations that are different than when you're looking at single family homes. So, and Dave is going to cover that today. Let me go through sort of the basics. I find that whenever we do these sessions, it's really helpful to make sure everybody's on the same page. And so we're going to talk about the basics of electric vehicles. We're going to talk about the difference between energy consumption and why that influences what chargers you should use. We'll go into AC and DC electricity, and we'll talk about available incentives. So when we talk about an electric vehicle, we refer to vehicles that have a battery on board that can be charged with a plug, and where a vehicle can run on purely electricity, or in the case of a plug-in hybrid, also on gas. There are some mild hybrids that you cannot plug in. We're not talking about those when we refer to electric vehicles. I think it goes without saying, you probably have seen this in the news, but experts predict that 1 in every 4 new cars sold will be electric in the next 3 years. So that means demand for EV charging from your tenants is only going to continue to grow. And it's important for you to start thinking about this. So when you think about EV charging, it's helpful to distinguish between the size of a battery in the vehicle, which is what you see in kilowatt hours on each row, and the energy that these vehicles consume, or in some way, the driving range. Oftentimes people think, oh, if I put in a charger, I have to be able to charge a full battery quickly. But the reality is, even if your vehicle has a 100 kilowatt hour battery, most people will drive only about 30 miles on an average day. So they don't need to supply 100 kilowatt hours of energy. And that means you don't need quite as powerful chargers. In fact, when you think about how much the average person drives, for a sedan, it's about 10 kilowatt hours per day. And then for a pickup truck, it's about 20 kilowatt hours per day. And if your tenants are going to be parked overnight, let's say 10 hours, that means that your power level, the average power level on your plugs, needs to only be between 1 to 2 kilowatt. This is a really important distinction. When you think about how fast you need to charge vehicles, there are 3 levels or categories of chargers: level 1, level 2, and DC fast chargers. They come with different power ratings and a whole bunch of equipment and infrastructure that needs to be installed. Paul is going to give you a little bit more information on what that looks like. The other distinction that's important to consider is there are some chargers that supply AC or alternative current, and some chargers that supply DC or direct current. The battery stores electricity in DC, but vehicles have an onboard charger. And so you can provide your tenants with AC or DC, and each of these has a benefit and a drawback. There's also a whole bunch of charging standards, and I'm going to quickly skim over them. You've heard of the North American Charging Standard. Probably have heard of the J1772. These are your standards for AC charging in the US. And then for DC charging, there's different plugs. And you probably have also heard that a lot of manufacturers are moving towards the NACS connector. This is a really cool image I found that shows the difference in size between the 2 different plugs. The reality is that this transition is probably going to happen towards the Tesla standard, but it will take time, and there's going to be adapters. So when you're thinking about deploying your charging infrastructure, I wouldn't let that be like a complete roadblock for you. It is something that charging companies are figuring out, you know, there's ways that you can adjust your chargers to address that. The last thing I wanted to mention regarding EVs is to think about where the plug goes. So some vehicles have the plug in the front, some of them have them on the front side, and some of them have them on the back side. And this is important for you as you think about your parking lot layout. There are, if you set diagonal parking, for example, it will be difficult for people to back up. So just think about that when you're designing your chargers. And then for charging incentives, there are a variety of incentives out there. There's federal, state, and utility incentives. And each of these incentives cover different parts of the EV charging infrastructure. Some of them cover the investment in make-ready infrastructure, what the utility needs to supply. Others cover the charger itself. So when you're thinking about these different incentives, make sure to really sort of like look at the fine print. And our team can provide more context on these for you. This is also something that we'll address in more detail in part 2. So let's go to a poll question again, please.
Okay, what level of familiarity do you currently have with electric vehicle charging infrastructure? So I know I have an electric vehicle, but I don't know much about the infrastructure part about it. So I would probably put not familiar for myself, but I'm curious to know how many of you have already looked into this and feel pretty familiar with it already. So let me wait till you get a little past the 50% mark here, and let's see what you all have. Okay, those are the results.
Okay, thank you. And I see that several of you are not that familiar with this, and that's why we always like to start with the basics, because it makes sure that we are all on the same page. So without further ado, I'll pass the ball over to Paul.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Adrian. Thank you for inviting us to this program. Very exciting. So we're going to discuss the different use cases for EV charging, explain the hardware components, and then reviews the different charging installations for rental properties, and also explore the purpose. So if we can go on to the next slide. So basically, when it comes to EV charging, you're looking at 3 different types of charging. You could have private dedicated charging, public charging, and fleet charging. Your private dedicated charging, you may find that in gated communities where somebody has to gain access to the property before they can gain access to the chargers. The chargers can also be controlled access. By being network chargers, you can actually control the access to the chargers that way also. Then you have what most of you are probably familiar with looking at, which are the public chargers, which you'll find out and about. And then fleet charging is probably not something that most of you are going to be dealing with at this point. Next, please. So let's start off with what is a level 2 charger. So a level 2 charger, there's 2 different types. You can have a wall mounted, which they call a wall box, or you can have a pedestal mounted. There are advantages to both. And that's one of the things that we will do in our site assessment, is to give you a recommendation on whether we think that would be more advantageous for you to mount your chargers directly on a wall versus having them on a pedestal. And that could be determined by access and egress for the chargers themselves. It could be factors could be the security of the chargers, the cord maintenance, anything like that. Next. So basically on the DC fast charging equipment, we have, again, like I said, the wall box pedestal mounted, which is what most people will see, or the standalone. There's also a third type, which is the one on the far right, which is a modular system. Those are systems you're going to find that are going to have some type of possible battery backup, so they're not using the grid directly to charge the charger for the vehicle charging. In an apartment complex, a multi-unit apartment complex, you're most likely going to see either the wall box individually mounted, or you're going to see a DC fast charger standalone type charger that people would use for longer charging durations. Next. So then going back to what I was just saying, so there's really, it breaks down to two different types of charging. You have your communal charging. You're normally going to find that in your visitor parking or shared parking lots. You're not going to find that as like one tenant has one space with one charger. It's going to be more you designated an area where people are allowed to charge, like Adrian was saying. In a lot of use cases, especially with the improvement in battery technology, it's not going to be necessary to hook up for the entire time. You're going to be able to probably offer a system where they'll have a dedicated area where they can charge. And then once they're done charging, they would move their vehicle and somebody else would move their vehicle in.
And I
The
think
other
this is
option would be the dedicated charging. That one can get a little more involved, and that's something we'd also be able to speak about in a site assessment. Next.
and I know, Paul,
Oh,
if
go
you
ahead.
don't mind me interjecting for a
Not at
second,
all.
I know many of you were asking about ways to monetize charging, and your decision about whether to deploy communal or public or dedicated makes a big difference. So in communal or public settings, you tend to see this sort of pricing per hour or per session or per kilowatt, depending on what area you live in. Whereas with dedicated chargers, these are an individual parking spot owners. And so the business model looks slightly different there. You might be looking more at like a monthly rental type of fee plus the cost of electricity. So as you think about how you want to deploy EV charging for your tenants, it's helpful to consider that there's different options available to you. Thanks, Paul.
Very good point. So like I said, so some of the considerations on a base level are going to be, should you mount it on the wall or should you have a pedestal? What Adrian was just talking about, which will probably one of the more important decisions to make, is network versus non-network. We always recommend network. Network is, it's very similar to a smart computer versus a dumb computer. You want a computer hooked up to the internet because then it's much more capable. With network charging, you're able to monetize, you're able to monitor who's using it, when they're using it, when they can use it, when they can't use it. So those are all things you want to take into consideration when you're making your selection. The other thing I touched upon briefly before was cable management. If there is a possible failure point for chargers, it's most likely going to be cable management. If people don't put the cables back and somebody runs over the cables, you could damage the copper. So having some type of cable management system and educating your tenants how you want them to handle the cables. So having something on the chargers explaining, hey, this is how you charge, and this is how we want you to, put everything back. Those are things that are very important for you to be able to communicate to your tenants. And then on the length of the cables, we try to recommend a 25-foot cable for areas where we're not sure, like Adrian had mentioned previously, depending on the mounting, where the actual hookup is for the car, you may need to have a little longer length. We have found that a 25-foot cable usually suffices for any hookup for any location within the vehicle.
And Paul, we got a question from an audience member, so I will address that.
Okay.
So Mike Wesselo asked about level 1. So basically what he said is, we started this premise saying that if your tenants are parked overnight for 10 hours, they're probably fine with 1 to 2 kilowatts of charging. And that is in fact true. There are multifamily properties that are deploying level 1 plugs or level 2 plugs, and there's smart charging solutions that allow you to deploy these in a cost-effective way. So some of these sort of technology differences and specific products, we're going to be addressing in part 2. Again, like we started by saying, this is a lot to take in an hour-long session. Based on our experiences working with utilities and other organizations, we have found that it's just better to be able to break it up. So Mike, I will connect with you to make sure that we are representing, level 1 options and we will be addressing them in part 2. And then, Paul, just in the interest of time, why don't we keep going to briefly talk about electricity costs and software, and then we'll move forward with Chris.
Okay. So with electricity cost components, you have the price per kilowatt hour, and the cost can depend on how much energy is consumed during the billing month. I know Chris is going to get into this a lot deeper in his presentation. Just suffice to say, as far as on the energy charges, the one thing I can tell you is they are state dependent. Some states allow you to charge per kilowatt hour. Other states will allow you to charge per charge. Those are things that you have to find out about your jurisdiction to know what is going to be allowed in your jurisdiction. That goes to the demand charges versus the fixed charges. The fixed charges would be similar to that, where you could charge a monthly charge. I do know from experience there are some states that do not allow you to do the monthly charge, so it's something that would be important to know for your jurisdiction. And then on the demand charges, again, Chris is going to dive into that in his presentation, so I'm going to leave that to him. Basically, the utilities have had something in place for well over 100 years, so it has nothing to do with EVs, but the demand charges are a calculation that has been made by the utility companies to try to figure out when your highest demand is for charging. And with the network charging and with computer programs, we can provide you with data to be able to figure out when the best time is to allow people to charge, to make it more affordable for the tenants and for the apartment owners. So that goes to the software. Going back to the smart chargers versus the non-networked and network chargers, the network chargers are going to be much more dynamic. Somebody had mentioned about the level 1 chargers. Yes, a level 1 charger would work, but generally a level 1 charger is not going to be a smart charger. You're going to find level 2 chargers, even low voltage ones that will be smart, that can be networked, that can use software. But I would caution that the solution is not to go onto the internet and find a level 1 plug-in charger that you think is going to work at your facility, because if it's not networked, you're going to have no control over who uses it, when they use it, and you won't be able to monetize it. With the software, you're going to be able to monetize it. You're going to be able to generate revenue. You're going to basically add value to your property because your tenants are going to be parking their vehicles overnight. And that is the most convenient time we have found that people are taking advantage of charging their vehicles. Okay.
So other benefits of EV charging software, whether it's level 1, 2, or 3, or having these connected chargers, is the ability to reduce capital expenses. So we see, oftentimes people start to look at, okay, what kind of panel upgrades or circuit breakers do we need to install? And when you use load management software, you can put multiple chargers on the same electric circuit, and that saves you capital expenditures. You don't need to spend as much to upgrade your existing infrastructure. And then lastly,
I apologize. I had stalled because I was reading a comment from Daryl. He commented in the chat, not in the question. And that's why I had stopped speaking for a moment. He was talking about reliability. And I think reliability falls back to the software, because he had stated that he's been driving an EV for more than 10 years. 10 years ago, EV charging definitely was not reliable because they weren't networked. People were putting them places where they would offer the charging for free. They weren't networked, so they weren't monitored, not only for monetizing, they weren't monitored for maintenance. Having a smart charger, having software, one of the biggest benefits is going to be, as soon as something's wrong, you're going to get notified something's wrong, and it's going to be able to be fixed immediately, versus having a charger that's out there for 3 months, 6 months that doesn't work. And it gets a reputation as being unreliable because nobody knows it's broken. And the software is going to address that issue because the software is going to constantly monitor the chargers and let you know as soon as something's wrong.
Okay, thank you. So let's jump to a poll question.
What aspect of electric vehicle charging would you like to learn more about? So I know we've covered a little bit of everything on this list, but it'd be interesting to see what you'd want to learn more on. So let's give you all a little bit more time to answer. Great. Okay. So I think I have a little over half of you that have participated. So I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results here. All right, it looks like choosing the type of electric vehicle charging equipment that makes the most sense came up as the number one, and then building a business case as two. So I'll let you take that from here.
Thank you. And Dave will talk about building a business case towards the end of the session. So let's keep going. And you can't really think about electric vehicle charging without thinking about the utility. So Chris Werner, who's the COO of Infinity Rack, and he's also a national qualifier for Titan Solar, is going to talk to us about the utility bill. And we're also going to be discussing this interesting interconnection, sort of connection between solar generation and electric vehicle charging. And you'll see why there's an interesting connection here.
Hey, so I'm going to talk briefly about a couple subjects. We'll start with how the utility bills you for electricity. We'll talk about some of the basics of how solar works. We'll talk a little bit about net metering, some of the benefits of pairing solar and EV charging, and some of the incentives available. We can go to the next slide. So utilities bill commercial properties several different ways. Most commonly, they'll charge based on two main components outside of the fixed cost. The first one is peak demand, which is the maximum instantaneous electrical draw in kW or kilowatts that is based on the highest reading over any 15 to 30 minute interval over the course of the month. And you may have two line items, one being for the maximum draw during peak hours and one for off-peak hours. Peak hours change throughout the year and are in the afternoons in the summer when the most energy is needed for cooling, and during the mornings in the winter when energy is needed for heating. The second component is energy delivered over time in the form of kilowatt hours. This will also be billed at different rates based on peak and off-peak hours, or sometimes done based on tiers. Tiers are when you're charged different rates depending on the number of kilowatt hours drawn over a month. For example, you may be charged one rate for the first 3,000 kilowatt hours consumed, and then the rate will change for the next 10,000 kilowatt hours, and again for energy consumed beyond that. Typically, the rate will decrease with each tier if you're billed that way. We can look at the next slide. So solar energy is produced by photovoltaic modules or solar panels, which convert photons to DC electricity. DC electricity, however, cannot be used by your building, so an inverter is used to convert that DC electricity to AC, which matches the utility power at your property. The solar electricity is then backfed to the building's electrical system to supplement power coming from the grid. Solar energy on its own is an intermittent power source, and the energy produced is directly affected by the available sunlight. You can look at the next slide. So the utility, you have to create an agreement with the utility and how your system would interact with it. And the ideal way to do that is through net metering. And net metering is an agreement with the utility in which you're able to get a credit for any excess power a solar system creates during the day and sends back to the grid toward power drawn when the system is not producing. This agreement basically allows you to use the grid as your battery and is the ideal scenario for interconnecting solar to the utility. You can look at the next slide. So here's a simple example of how energy is accounted for in a net metering agreement with the utility. Energy sent back to the grid is simply deducted from the energy drawn. Something to note is that not all of the energy your system produces is accounted for on the utility bill. This is because the utility meter cannot see power that is produced by the solar system and used in real time by the building. You can only see the power passing through the utility meter to or from the grid. One last thing to consider is that the demand charges are difficult to offset with solar without a battery system because it is an intermittent power source and demand is based on that peak draw at any given point during the month. This means it will likely be determined from a moment in time when the solar system is producing little or no power. In part 3, we'll get into more detail on the interconnection process with the utility and some of the other solar metering arrangements, as well as how to use batteries to reduce demand. We can look at the next slide. So pairing solar with EV charging has several advantages. We're going to go over just a couple of them. You can sell that energy you produce with solar at a premium through car charging systems. There are ways to use battery systems to offset the demand requirements of car charging to reduce the need for utility upgrades. You can get increased rent through offering covered parking or covered outdoor gathering spaces like covered picnic or event areas or poolside awnings. And then you can also enjoy the PR value of having a green community and offering electric car charging from renewable energy. In part 3, we're going to go over a case study of how energy savings from solar and the available incentives can result in an instant ROI on installing solar because you're increasing the cap rate of the property. We can look at the next slide. So this slide shows an example of the number of solar panels needed to offset the energy needs of different electric cars. Depending on the vehicle type and how much it is driven, anywhere from 2 kW to 7.5 kW solar will cover the annual needs of that car. And then we'll hit the last slide. So here we're looking at a couple of the available incentives for solar projects. Between just the federal incentives, you can recoup 50% or more of the project costs. Some states and utilities will also have additional incentives to recoup additional money installing solar. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into this in the following sessions. That's everything that I have and can answer any questions.
Chris, why did you get into the solar industry?
So I got into the solar industry based on a need for us. We had an off-grid property that did not have access to utilities, and we had an incident there that required us to figure out a way quickly to have off-grid power. And when we started doing that, I actually got involved with it with my father in the mid-90s and started doing a lot of off-grid systems. And then moved down into the Southeast and saw a need for it and been involved with it my entire career.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And I saw a question, one of the participants was asking why we're talking about solar. And one of the reasons why we wanted to address this topic is because, when you're thinking about your electricity bills, solar provides an opportunity to get some cost savings, but there's also quite a few incentives available to deploy solar. And so for property owners that have outdoor parking, for example, it can provide a really interesting combination for charging and solar in a way to create additional value for the cap rates of your properties.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll chime in just real quick with a little anecdote if you don't mind. But I know I'm working from home today, but our office building just got exactly the picture you showed with the solar panels on top and then the chargers down below, just like that. And it really does elevate the property. I know it's a little different because it's a commercial property, but at least from our perspective, we thought it was something that was really cool just to have, first of all, covered parking because we had our cars out in the sun, but not only that, but the solar is being used as part of that. And then also I can charge my car. Like, it was fantastic. So I just wanted to chime in with that, just so you're wondering, if you're still wondering how they connect, certainly at a commercial location, it can make a difference. I'm sure multifamily, they'll feel the same way.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to David Hein, and he's going to be talking about the business case for EV charging. Now, before we can talk about the business case, it's also important to think about the cost drivers in the process to deploy charging. So we're going to keep going.
So what we're going to do is we're going to learn about 4 different objectives. So the first objective is what electric equipment is required for EV charging.
And Dave, my
Yes.
apologies, but I just saw that somebody raised their hand.
Sure.
Alexandra, is it possible for people to ask questions? Do we have the setup where people can speak
Yeah,
up?
so at this time, I think I have all participants muted. So if you do raise your hand, if you could put your comment in the chat, we could get to it a little quicker, but I don't think I have a way to just unmute a specific person.
Okay.
So we'll leave it at that. Sorry.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
So please put your question in the chat. Thank you. All right, back to you,
So the
Dave.
second, yeah, thank you. So back to the second objective. So how do you evaluate your property? We have 3 different levels that we'll discuss. Objective number 3 is how to install your EV chargers, doing it in 4 easy steps, breaking it down to keep it simple. And then finally, can I calculate my business case? How do I do that? How do I calculate my business locations for EV charging? Next slide. So electrical equipment. In multifamily, you're going to deal with 2 different types. The larger the property, the more you're going to go to more of a 480 volt, which is a standard for commercial. When you deal with smaller properties, depending on how it's constructed, you're going to deal with more of a 208 system. And so with that, it is basically combining the charging stations with the type of availability there. And so when you're dealing with a 480, you might have to bring in a step down transformer because the level 2s are not connected. They're 208s instead of 480s. And then when you're analyzing the site, we're recommending at least 20 chargers at a time, but that still depends upon the size of the property. Next slide. Here's 3 different photographs just to help you to connect the different components. The left side, you can see electrical panel. All of us know what electrical panel is. Conduit goes up to number 2 there, to image, a distribution box. And then finally, it comes down to where the location of the charger is. Even if the municipality does not require that wire that goes from the junction box to the charger to be in those conduits, we always recommend it. It's just better overall because the codes require it. Remember, local codes sometimes don't require what the international code is. Everybody can choose. We're going to go in a lot more detail with parts 2 and 3 on examples of charging installations at rental properties. Next slide, please. So here is the EV readiness. This is objective number 2. So I've got this property. How do I analyze this? Well, the basic way to do it is through as-built drawings and also with having someone on site. So EV ready, we refer to that as it's been designed that way. A lot of architects and engineers are encouraging new properties to make sure that this is already designed. Tier 2 is where it's capable. We find out through as-builts, through talking to the original electrician, that there's enough power there, but nothing was designed. So they have spaces in the panels. They have enough power on the transformer, which is easily coordinated with the utility company to see that, okay, we can put chargers in there. And then the final one, tier 3, is EV curious. So this is where it takes a little bit more effort. In-person site visits have to be done. And then through as-builts and communicating with an electrician on site and coupling it with an electrical engineer, we can pretty much come up with how many chargers can be at that property without upgrading, because that's the key thing. You want to keep this simple on your first phase of a project. You most probably will have to have electrical plans done on all 3 phases. Sometimes, like with tier 1, If the project's under already construction or it was just finished, you can literally piggyback off of the existing permit. Next step. So how do I install my chargers? Okay, it kind of starts to get overwhelming. You can see we broke this down into 4 easy steps. Site assessment. What is entailed with site assessment? Step 2, now we have to go from design concept in step 1 to engineering plans, go through to permitting, and then finally get your permit to construction. That's easy. You install the chargers, you upgrade the system if you have to, and then finally follow through. And follow through really does fall into one of the most important aspects, and we have seen too many locations just really not follow through. So what does follow through mean? Well, that means that you not only tell your tenants that you have EV chargers, that's a no-brainer, right? But you definitely extend out to the public and take advantage of this and let the public know. Why is that? Well, that just brings in more tenants, because we have found, and that's why so many property managers are coming to us, is, hey, I'm losing leases because I don't have charging stations. So more and more people are recognizing the need for it, and property managers are starting to realize, you know what, let's do this in phases. Like we said, up to 20 at a time, depending upon the size of it. Now we're going to go into more detailed examples in part 2 or 3, even going into some more detail about what you do for installation. Where do you put the charger? Do you put it behind the sidewalk? Do you put it up at the front? When do you put bollards in? And then permitting processes. Each municipality in each state is different because they're allowed to. And then it couples into, okay, what does the county require? And we're going to go into more details. Do there need to be special striping? No, there doesn't. Do you need to make sure that the charging station is next to an a handicap spot? All these things are parts of step number 2, and we're going to go into more detail with that. Next slide. Then finally, our objective number 4. How do you calculate this and see if this is really going to be the best for you? Well, our team has put together a profit calculator, and the profit calculator will help you to answer the following questions you can see. So what are the costs involved? And that includes hardware, maintenance, and software. Okay. Number 2, what is my revenue potential? Should I have a separate area for public charging to draw the public into my site? We recommend that highly. You don't have to go to DC fast chargers, because remember, the EV world, what they want to do is what's called topping off. So they're passing through, they got to go to Target. Guess what? Target doesn't have any chargers, but they know that your property has a public charging station destination, or they're going to swing in, and then you can charge for that. See, you can do it for free for 3 months. We always recommend that. And then you start charging for the usage. And then, you have to analyze what the state will allow. But there's so many different options now that you can charge based upon usage, how much time they're there. California, they actually are requiring that the charging stations have a meter. So it's literally like a gas pump. So, and we think that's going to be a nationwide thing. And then what's the rental value? What is it? Why am I bringing this in? And through our other sessions, we're going to go into more detail about that. So as you're analyzing your site, remember, what type of charging station do I need? And you say, well, that's simple. I just go to this charger. It gives me this much power. I got to, provide this much power for it. But you got to go a little deeper, and that's where a design concept is so important. For instance, how many times does the software ping to the charger? You say, well, what difference does that make? Well, some chargers go 4 hours before they check the health of the charger. So you want to find a charging software that pings it every 5 minutes, every 15 minutes. And what that does is it allows the software company to be able to deploy maintenance before anyone even finds out about it. We know of softwares where we call it the heartbeat. And so we can literally minimize that failure that so many people have read online. It's all because the chargers are not pinging enough. They're not checking the health of it. And then we're going to go into more detail about the health of the machine. You say, well, what difference does that make? Well, it's like any other thing. You've got to maintain the system. So we're going to give you point by points on what you need to do to be able to keep the health of the charger and the infrastructure in place so that people will start to count on your chargers. The tenants can count on it. And also, if you end up doing a public EV charging system, people will start to count on that, which again helps you to follow through and become the spot for people to come to, which will lead to people wanting to be renting from your place because they can count on things.
So we got a question from one of the audience member asking if the EV model compares to that of a Tesla supercharging station. And I think this is where, as a property owner, you have the flexibility to determine how you want to monetize your stations. Depending on your parking lot layout, you can choose to have dedicated parking charging that's only available to your tenants, or you can choose to deploy DC fast chargers that are open to visitors and the public. And so depending on how you envision providing this service to your tenants and providing this value to the community, that influences the type of equipment that you select, and it affects your business model. So part of the reason why we wanted to be able to sort of have these three kind of segments to this course is because we find that for every one of these topics, when you go back to these four things, for example, there's a rabbit hole that we can go down, and there's a lot of really interesting questions that people have. And we want to make sure that we can walk you through each of these steps. The other thing that I'll mention is as part of the boot camp, and for you to participate in the session, we're going to make time available from the presenters for you to join and have a one-on-one consultation. So if you have questions, you can get them answered directly. So this is good timing.
And I had
Thank
one.
you.
Yep, I had one more thing to add. So the profit calculator that we did create, we are going to share that with everyone.
That's right.
Yep. And so that'll allow you to basically put in certain components that you might already know. And then in this free consultation, we can also give you the pieces that you don't have yet. So it is extremely important to make sure that, number one, keep it simple. Remember, when you go with a level 1 charger, it takes a lot longer for the vehicle to charge. And at one time we needed that. I remember working with Cape Canaveral when they were trying to decide between 1 and 2. We encouraged them to go to 2. Well, for property managers, for apartment complexes, condos, level 2 is the lowest you want to go. Why? Because you want people to be able to go in, because the batteries are getting larger. You want them to be able to go in, charge that night, because you get the bigger trucks, they're taking 8 to 10 hours to charge. And then remember, they have 350 miles, so you can do the math. So that's why it's, you want to have enough charge so they can just get it. And then 4 or 5 days later, they have to come back in, unless they decide to stop at a restaurant and get a quick charge. So the business model can be set up so that you don't have to take a lot of real estate away now, especially because the battery sizes of the vehicles are so much bigger.
If I could add to that, Dave, just briefly, I think one of the important things for the apartment owners to know is that, and it's happened over the past like 6 to 12 months, there's been a major shift in the thinking of electric vehicle charging. At one point, when the battery capability wasn't there, it was going to involve very long charging times, and it wasn't going to be dedicated parking spaces. With the battery technology improving, Now the expectation is going to be for people to charge and top off where they live. And I think that was one of the biggest shifts, is we went from a gas station model where people would go to a location and get a charge, to now the expectation going forward is going to be able to charge overnight where you live.
So in conclusion, on our section, you can see we briefly talked about electrical equipment that's required, 3 tiers to help you to kind of minimize down how to evaluate your property. 4 easy steps. Adrian made a good comment. There's all different steps inside, but you can keep it down to those 4 steps to install the EV chargers. And then there's a lot of different variations at your location. So it all depends upon the community itself. And one of the things that's important to ask for is like a community assessment report. And that community assessment report analyzes what chargers are located out there. Are there EV manufacturers locally? How about dealers? Are they promoting it? All this will help us to be able to see if you want to only put charging stations in at the property, or is it really beneficial, and can I make money off of putting charging stations in a public area to draw traffic to my site? Back to you, Adrian.
Thank you. So I'm starting to see some questions about the boot camp and some of the costs associated. So we're going to jump into it. We started by saying there's a lot of content here, just based on our experience. This is stuff that is complicated and we want to be able to make it accessible. And that's why we partnered with AOA. What we're offering for members is a discount of $300. For early bird pricing, it's $300. So the price of the boot camp is going to be $299. And what you get out of it is, first of all, you're going to save a lot of money. Think about how much your time is worth and how much time you want to investigate. All of you can do Google research, but you'll find that this can get pretty overwhelming. So we put together a really great set of speakers that are industry experts that can help you shorten this learning cycle. And then if you're not quite ready to make a decision by September 5th, you can also book a consultation with any of the speakers here. There's no cost associated with it. For EV Refleet, we really are an education first company. And so our objective is for you to be able to have your questions answered. And then whether you want to continue participating or not, that's ultimately going to depend on what is valuable to you, how much you value your time, how ready you are to make decisions. You'll find that through these engagements with our speakers that people are really not going to be pushing you to make a direction or not. And I think this is what's different and what's missing in this industry. I think that there's not a lot of organizations that are out there really trying to simplify information and make it common sense. So we have a question here for you to let us know if you are interested in hearing more about the bootcamp. We'll send you a curriculum and more information. Give you 30 seconds to answer.
Yeah, well, I can keep it pulled up if you all want to start addressing some of the questions that have come into the question box. Just a reminder for you all to put your question in the Q&A, not the chat, so that we can get better track of which questions we've answered. So from the test, I'm sure that's not your name, but hi. Which chargers have the best app is the first question that I have here. Dave?
So it depends upon what you are looking for and the site itself. So if you have an apartment complex that has garages, strictly garages, where everybody parks, then you want a company that kind of addresses that. And we know of one company called Zeal Energy, and they have 100% guaranteed because of that problem. If you're looking where all of your parking spaces are out in the open, then you don't need to worry about that. There are two companies that come to mind. One is Epic, because they are literally software engineers and they customize a lot of sites. And then, of course, there's another company that's called NovaCharge. Their specialty is more directed toward EV fleets. But what's interesting about their software is they're the ones that have literally an AI system that is monitoring the locations 24/7. I do believe that Epic and NovaCharge both ping the machines every 5 minutes, which is extremely important. Hopefully
I could add to that. Another thing to look for in software is software that is going to work with OCPP compliance, because that will allow you to mix and match your chargers. You don't have to dedicate your resources to one particular charger. If you have different use cases and you have software that's OCPP compliant, you can have one software platform that will control all your chargers.
That's great. Another question came through from Joseph about property insurance, electric vehicle charging made available to tenants compared to electric vehicle charging made available to the public. So I think just an overview of how insurance might have a part in this, and also any differences you'd like to point out about what's the difference between offering this to tenants versus the public. Dave, I'll let you to answer that one.
So I'll tackle the last one, offering it to only tenants and to the public. Remember, the key thing about this is to utilize the fact that people need chargers that are reliable. So by doing your homework on the type of charger you need, then you can have confidence that that charger will be reliable. And it is based upon that software. Making sure that there's a health to the machine. Adding public chargers allows you to charge a fee. So as the presentation showed, you have a place where you have high traffic going by all the time. Well, you want to designate, and you don't have to make it very large. Remember that. You can put in 2, 3 level 2 charges, depending on the size of the property, that you can designate and then charge per session. And you say, well, how much can I charge? Well, it all bases upon the area. That's why you want like a community assessment report to see what other chargers are. But we have found between $5 to $7 per session. A lot of times they only want to be there an hour just to top off. It's like going to the gas station and putting 2 gallons in. EV owners, that's what they do. Most of them do. So we encourage that unless you have a location that's way out in the middle of nowhere and it's more of a resort, if this is in the heart of the city and heart of the urban area, you do want to designate and advertise that you have not only public, not only a tenant charging, because your tenants really need it, but you want to have and advertise that you have public charging available.
Great answer. R. Royce asking, what is the cost to make a site? So any, and I saw somebody else asking about costs. I'm assuming that it's going to vary quite a bit, but it's probably worth having a consult, I'm sure, to estimate any sort of costs associated with this.
Yeah, I can chime in, or you know what, better yet, why don't we let Jessica chime in? We had a slide introducing her.
Yes.
She's our programs director. She has a really fascinating background. She was actually the general manager at one of the public charging networks here in Ontario. So Jessica, do you have any just high level guidelines on what cost looks like? I know it varies a lot on the ground, depending on the conditions, what EV tier you're in, EV readiness tier, how much construction needs to go in. But if you can provide any high level guideline, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. The cost, and thank you, Adrian, for the introduction. Costs that need to be taken into consideration goes from everything from the equipment, even to the weather. So, for example, here in Canada, you have to be very selective on the kind of the time of the year that you are going to be constructing. So it depends of the case. It depends on how much you want to leverage your investment in terms of the transformers that are required, the equipment, the size. So I think the best way to provide an estimation is to book a consultation with the experts here that will be able to assess case by case. Yeah, so that will be my advice.
Great point. I hadn't even considered weather, maybe because I'm in Los Angeles. So another question here, what is the life of the charging station?
Yeah, I can comment on this. So what I've seen is, let me talk about warranties. What I've seen from a manufacturer perspective is, the standard warranty is 3 years. You can get extended warranty. These are level 2 chargers, extended warranties for typically 5 years. I've seen some as long as 10 years. But when you get into a 10-year warranty, they're basically charging you for twice the price of hardware. It's an interesting time in our industry because there's a lot of manufacturers out there. Some of them have better reputations for durability than others. I would say generally level 2 chargers are less complicated, so they tend to break down less often. But you can expect you should be able to expect anywhere from 2 to 10 years for a level 2 charger, and I don't know, maybe 2 to 5 years for a DC fast charger. Dave, is this what you've seen in the ground? I know you've deployed over 500 charging stations.
Yeah, in fact, interestingly, we found that with the level 2, the smaller the charger, like you said, the better it is. There's some chargers out there that are, they're all one piece. Well, guess what? That's going to be hard. If something breaks, then you got to ship it back. So you want to stick with your small level 2 chargers. And looking back over the 14 years that I've been doing this, I really don't recall a whole bunch of maintenance issues, as long as the client, number one, made sure that they had software that pinged the machine constantly, because sometimes it's just a quick little reboot. And number two, that they were checking the machine properly, not just looking at it and polishing it, but digging deep into it, which follows not just into checking the charger, but also infrastructure. So it's like anything else. You maintain it, it will last, and they do last. I would say closer, most of them, I would say up to 10 years. We still have chargers we installed 12 years ago that are still functioning.
That's great. All right. Another question here that came in from Michael, not knowing the type of vehicle the tenant needs. Do we just install a level 220V electrical outlet? Dave, I'll let you take that one.
I can address address that one. First of all, in the commercial setting, you cannot install just a 220 outlet. Code requires, international code requires that it's hardwired. So you can't buy a level 2 charger with a pigtail with a plug on it and plug it in. Okay. Now you might have a municipality that doesn't look at that, but again, you can understand that. So the advantage to the chargers are the fact that they have protocols inside them. They don't activate electricity until the vehicle talks to the charger. If you just have a plug-in, then you're losing that safety issue. So it's really a safety issue, and you always want to follow the local codes, and that's all part of a design concept evaluation.
Great. So I don't see any more open questions, but I would like to touch on a couple that I saw that you all answered. Our panelists here answered online by typing. One was about what programs you can use to fund the project. And Chris, you put in a couple of really great resources. I just wanted to point out, maybe we can include them in the follow-up email if you're interested in learning about those incentives. Chris put sunstonecredit.com and dsireusa.org. So I'll go ahead and share those with you. That is also something, obviously that is a nice benefit of this on top of all the other things that we talked about, having that potential there for those incentives. And I'd also like to close out with any other additional comments that you all have as speakers here that you'd like to share before we go. One last thing, anyone want to give us a final concluding thought here on our webinar? Adrian.
Well, this has been fun. We do these fairly regularly, and this is my first experience doing it with property owners, rental property owners. So it was fun to look at this from the perspective of, what's the revenue model here? But, the long story short is we really enjoy this. It is an industry that I think is fascinating. It's kind of confusing. And, our goal is to be able to just kind of make this common sense, as simple and as approachable for all of us, because I think that helps us all create healthier communities. If this stuff is more accessible to you, you can make better infrastructure decisions for your tenants. That means you get to save money. We've heard stories of people putting in chargers and spending more than they should, and we're talking about thousands of dollars more than they should. But ultimately, it's all about drivers and people in our communities, and the more that we can provide EV charging to them, I think the better off all of us will be. And so that's really at the core of EV Refleet and the EV Charging Institute. It's about how can we make all this information easily digestible and accessible so that we can all as a community get together and move forward. So thank you very much for listening to us. It was a real pleasure. Alexandra will follow up with slides and contact information. We're also going to give you a website where you can pick, which of the speakers you want to speak with, and you can talk to all of us or none of us. It's up to you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and charge on.
Thank you. Yes. And Dana just asked if the consultation is free. Just one last thing. It is free. So
Yes.
Please take advantage and contact them. I'm going to email you guys tomorrow. Please take the exit survey as you leave. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this webinar, and we will be in touch soon. So thank you so much. And I will be in touch. Have a wonderful day,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Take care.